Hello, I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga, and welcome to our Saturday matinee. For this week's presentation, we're going to be exploring some fascinating architectural styles over the history of the city of Mississauga, surviving examples of the different styles of architecture that are within our city today. They help illustrate the evolution, the path that our city has walked, and you might drive around the city today and just marvel at or look at with new eyes at some of the historical styles that are evident throughout our landscape today, and kind of reflect on what it means as a city coming of age as it has grown over time. You might be surprised living in the modern city of Mississauga how old some of our buildings actually are. The oldest documented building that we have in the city of Mississauga predates 1820. We have a number of historic buildings, both listed and designated under the terms of the Ontario Heritage Act, many of which remain private family dwellings even to this day. It's a remarkable look to explore the architecture of a community and kind of highlight its story through its built expression. Yes, many of the buildings built in historic Mississauga do not survive, but there are many that do, and they help illustrate the path that our city has walked from its earliest years of settler culture to its present day. And it is a remarkable look at exploring the landscape of what is the city of Mississauga today through its historic architectural styles. Much of Ontario, including Mississauga in that, is truly a landscape of alterations, not originals. We're only really meant to see the most fashionable exterior, the final decision, if you will, the most recent alteration to a building. Usually their buildings reflect kind of high aspirations with vernacular abilities, whether it be the access to raw materials, the ability to afford raw materials, the skill in which to build it, to what is available within the community. And so what we really see are buildings that reflect a vernacular adaptation on popular motifs that were prevalent throughout Europe, the British Empire, North America at the time. We have a wide array of examples of all different types of architecture here in Mississauga, but very seldom do we have a building that reflects a pure ideal of a particular architectural style. More often it's a blend. And again, we're only really meant to see the latest alteration or finish. And so what we have are a landscape really of alterations, of generations of decision making that have created something rather unique, although perhaps not singularly identified to one particular architectural style. Most structures in that realm show a mix of influences and needs. The buildings in the era of which we're talking are really meant to be functional buildings. Very little was made in terms of grandiose ornamentation. Buildings had a practical purpose, and the need to build them was also fueled out of practicality. And so we see that on our landscape today, and we can look at, again, things like the building materials that are used. They really reflect what was readily available, but also what skill was available to build. So quite often our earliest structures are on wood. Wood was forgiving, it was readily available, and required the lowest degree of skill in terms of building it. And as society evolved, as capital became more prevalent, you started to see a little bit more permanent structures, whether they be in brick or stone, and eventually into things like concrete, all of which require a certain skill and certain ability to process and acquire that material and to work with that material. And so our landscape reflects all of these things, and we'll explore this and really briefly through the course of this presentation. This is not meant to be an exhaustive exploration of architecture in Mississauga. We invite you to explore more. We invite you to read more, kind of look at the landscape with different eyes, if you will. The land can talk. Buildings can talk if we know how to look and listen to them, and to hear the story or to explore the story that they're telling to us. I do highly recommend a book by Professor Thomas McElraith, formerly with University of Toronto, Mississauga. It's called Looking for Old Ontario, a remarkable book on exploring the Ontario landscape, but also some significant resources within looking at buildings, building forms, building structures, and more importantly, the thought that went into creating the different architectural forms that are in our community, and what how it expressed itself, not only in the landscape, but what it expressed about the society that built them. So, kind of jumping right in to our exploration of landscape, we'll start really of what is arguably the original form of built structure on the landscape, really romantically seen as kind of that first settler homestead, if you will, and that being the log cabin. Generally, log cabins were the first house built by early settlers. Generally, they were to 16 by 20 feet, although there was variation within, and quite often the measurements were not exact when it came to building these structures. They were simply built structures, quite often only 2 rooms, maybe 3 if you were lucky. But these were very vernacular, simple structures on the landscape. They were often repurposed, reclad, prone to alterations over time. It was a stable, versatile medium, the wood in which it was built, and it was readily available. But also, there was a time when living in a log cabin was actually seen as a little backward. And so you tended to have log cabins that were either replaced or reclad, veneered, if you will. And over time, that symbol of the log cabin gradually disappears from our landscape for the most part. Although we do have a couple of surviving log cabins within the city of Mississauga today. Neither one in their original location, mind you. They have been relocated. But they were built of wood, which was a forgiving material, again, readily available. And wood itself over time does naturally deteriorate, and you have this gradual disappearance from the landscape, with a few exceptions that survive. And so, log cabin period is roughly seen from about early 1800s to the mid 19th century, but has over time largely disappeared, been replaced by secondary structures, a secondary home on a property over time. But there's also a romantic appeal to a log cabin. So as people have uncovered elements of log cabins within structures that have been altered over time, there seems to be more of a move now to celebrate and save those features, which is an interesting circle that society has evolved in, that the log cabin has gone from being a necessary first structure to an undesirable structure to something that has romantic inclinations that the people are quite attached to, of perhaps a throwback to a simpler and grander time. But nonetheless, we do have some examples of log cabins that survive on our landscape today. Really, the first kind of, use the term, more permanent building to be built on our landscape were often in the Georgian style, though not solely in the Georgian style. These were usually secondary homes on a landscape, replacing a log cabin, a symbol of a well-to-do family. They are identified through their balanced facades, kind of heavy ornamentation, but without embellishment. Minimal detailing, but there is a simplicity, a symmetry, and a solidity to the structures, the 3 S's. And these were meant to express a permanence on the landscape. They were often built in brick or stone and were meant to survive. Again, these were buildings that were largely replacing an earlier log cabin from a family, and solidity is probably the best description for Georgian style on the landscape. At the same time, in the Georgian style, you had something evolving called the Loyalist Tradition, which were homes that were, in its appearance, were quite similar to the balanced facade of the Georgian home. There's a mixture of American and British architectural traditions, which was brought to Upper Canada from our early Loyalist immigrants. But they were kind of grand aspirations with the simple raw materials that were available to them. And so you have homes that tended to grow and expand with additions over time. They were often built of wood, expressing itself as this ideal on the landscape. Again, simple layouts, simple designs with this hat tip, if you will, to grander aspirations of a landed society. And for many, like the Georgian, a second home after a log cabin. The difference being is that they were most often built in wood, and as such were prone not only to alterations but also to replacement over time, and as such very few of them survive on our landscape today. You also had the Saltbox that emerged, again, often seen as a secondary home to a log cabin, but one with much simpler design from the Georgian or the Loyalist tradition. Basically, an expanded cabin with a long sloped pitch on the roof on one side, which was generally facing the wind, to kind of cut down on the exposure of the building to inclement weather, but also to add for additional living space. These were once very common structures. Only a few examples survive in our community today, one of which is notably the Bradley Museum, one of the museums here in the city of Mississauga. And this reflects, again, kind of a vernacular adaptation on a cabin from an early settling farming family. These were built at the same time that some of their neighbors might be building the Georgian or Loyalist tradition houses, but reflected a much less prosperous, perhaps, a way of creating a more permanent footprint on the landscape for a farming family. You also had neoclassical evolve, and some of our earliest surviving building in the city of Mississauga is neoclassical, and that is the Cherry Hill House, which was built between 1817 and 1822. Neoclassical, they followed traditional Georgian design with a new emphasis on more ornamentation. There is a kind of a lightness to the architecture, almost a gaiety, refined elegance. They tended to have, many of them were built with verandas or porches on them. So again, they combine kind of the layout and the facade, the balanced facade of a Georgian, but with a little bit more gaiety and lightness of the architectural style, some more refinement to them, some more increased detailing. So they combined kind of that Georgian-esque inspiration with a little bit more of an emphasis on detailing. And again, our oldest surviving house in Mississauga, building in Mississauga, the Cherry Hill House, built between 1817 and 1822. We also have the era of the Regency, and these were often connected with well-to-do families, government officials, gentlemen farmers, etc. Regency is also termed as the Ontario cottage style. But the Regency architecture, which was predominant during the reign of the Prince Regent, during the reign of King George, it was not common in Canada because it was somewhat impractical in northern climates. This is much more common kind of in Britain and in the southern United States. Buildings were meant to be ornamental. They were meant to be seen from the road, almost a focus on the being seen, expression of wealth, if you will. Balanced facades, center hall plans, a very refined and elegant touch to architecture, but with the sheer amount of glass in what was always, or almost always, a south-facing facade. Was not ideal in Canadian climate weathers, and these buildings proved to be, over time, quite drafty and cold in the northern climate. So you didn't see a lot of them being built, and as a result, certainly not many of them survive. Two survive, which are both fine examples of the Regency style of architecture. One is the Grange, which is the home of Heritage Mississauga, and the other is the Anchorage, the former Skinner House, which is now part of the Museums of Mississauga at the Bradley Museum Complex. Both examples of Regency architecture, although they do differ slightly in their layout and size. Nonetheless, both of them are part of that Regency style tradition of architecture. You also had Classical Revival, and you'll see a few of these in the city of Mississauga, both with buildings that were public buildings at a time. One a former Orange Lodge, the other the Old Britannia Schoolhouse, and many early schoolhouses were built in the Classical Revival style. The Classical Revival was a response to an increased interest in classical Greek architecture. And so you see in a very vernacular and simplistic way this throwback to these facades of inspired by classical Greek architecture. Vertical lines, pediments, gable ornamentation, like a design within the gable, whether it be in both these buildings cases, you have the round circle imprinted in the building, often with the date of construction or some other phrase within that within the circle. But you don't have the kind of the statues and the pediments that were in Greek architecture, but you do have a throwback to this almost temple style inspiration for the facades of buildings. And quite often this type of architecture was used in public buildings, and certainly in Mississauga that's the case. The buildings that survived were both public edifices. And you have other examples of classical revival that we can see in historic pictures of buildings that do not survive to the modern era, but reflect that style of architecture, of this interest, this renewed interest in classical Greek architecture. Perhaps the most common style of architecture, not only in historic Mississauga, but also throughout Ontario, is referred to as Gothic Revival, the Ontario Gothic, if you will, the Ontario Vernacular, the Vernacular Cottage, all kind of referencing to the Gothic Revival architecture. And these were the story and a half buildings that had usually a peaked window in the center gable, reflecting the fact that although these buildings were definitely 2 stories in height, because from the front facade they had a 1-story perspective, or a story and a half, they were taxed at a lower rate back in a time when property tax was implemented based on the size of your house. So this was a cheap way a simple way of cheating the system, if you will, in terms of the tax. But these were the most common type of farm buildings built, the Ontario Vernacular or the Gothic Revival, prior to the Second World War. Center gable, often with a lancet or rounded window in the center gable, giving illusion or alluding to the fact there is a second story of living space on it. Often with verge board, decorative trim, and quite specifically with polychromatic brick. What you'll find in a community is usually the most common and cheapest color of brick was used in the vast majority of the building, while the detailing was left for more expensive or rarer types of brick. And so here in Peel and throughout this part of Southern Ontario, you tend to have the red or orange clay brick making up the majority of the building, and the buff brick making up the detailing and trim. Other places of Ontario, that process is reversed, where you have the buff brick buildings with the red brick detailing. And so that again reflects kind of the vernacular aspects of this building, but also the availability of building materials that reflect itself on the landscape today. And so again, in Mississauga, we have numerous examples of the Gothic Revival or the story and a half farmhouse, and you'll see these throughout Southern Ontario. Indeed, one of our most prevalent historic architectural styles in Ontario. Alongside the Gothic Revival, you also had a subset of that was referred to as Carpenter Gothic. And a simple way of looking at the Carpenter Gothic is usually Gothic-inspired buildings built of wood that are highly ornamented. And so these became kind of showpieces, if you will, for the skill of the builder. Some fine examples here in the city of Mississauga of the Carpenter Gothic, not nearly as prevalent as the Gothic Revival or the story and a half, but nonetheless something that you do see scattered throughout the Ontario landscape. Usually, again, built of wood, highly ornamented with extravagant detailing, kind of showcasing the abilities of the builder and the society that is supporting it. The Victorian, a term that we probably all reference as the Victorian era, under the time of Queen Victoria of Great Britain. Victorian architecture was usually Gothic inspired, but dressing up or making more highly ornamented facades, whether it be brick detailing or just the orientation of a facade. Quite often you see these in public buildings, but you also see some expression on simple houses with higher detailing. As the Victorian era evolved, you had more and more extravagance, but they often do not survive. These buildings were towards the end of their lives, were often seen as impractical, hard to heat, hard to maintain with the detailing that would deteriorate in our climate. And so Victorian, although it is a term that is thrown around a great deal, it is something that we do not have a great deal of examples of here in historic Mississauga. And again, Victorian, the emphasis was on detailing and craftsmanship, but also associated with that would be an expense. And in rural areas, you don't tend to find a great deal of Victorian era style of houses. You have houses that are built during the Victorian era, but they're built in quite often a more simplistic form. But a couple of examples survive of Victorian era buildings with the highly ornamented detailing, but again, not common. High Victorian Gothic, we have one example of that, and it's considered a fine example. That's Streetsville United Church, built in 1876. Brick construction, high emphasis on detailing with a vertical mass to it to kind of draw your eyes heavenward, if you will. These were quite often, this high Victorian was used in churches and public buildings, but predominantly in churches. High windows, stained glass. There's an imposing element to the solidity to the building itself. A grandeur, again, meant to draw your eyes upwards. And again, a focus on detailing and ornamentation. And so we have a good example here in Mississauga of High Victorian, and that being the Streetsville United Church. Italianate, similar to this idea of the evolving Victorian taste that saw a high degree of ornamentation and detailing that evolved. Italianate movement was kind of inspired by the Classical Revival movement of Greek architecture, but taking its influences from the Italian Renaissance. Also, some Swiss elements have found their way into the Italianate movement as well. Often you can see them with patterns. Asymmetrical additions seem to be fashionable at a time. Exaggerated detailing with cornices, capitals, window detailing applied to the facade, verge board, decorative trim, and the like. So we do have a number of examples of the Italianate inspired buildings, again with this detailing and ornamentation, verge board trim, and the like. So we have examples throughout Mississauga of the Italianate inspiration of architecture. We only have one example of Romanesque Revival architecture here in Mississauga, and that's a former public school building, SS number 11 Dixie, which was built in 1921. The building still survives today, although no longer a school building. The Romanesque Revival architecture, high buildings, undulating and asymmetrical roof lines, built of brick or stone, meant to emphasize solidity on the landscape. The architecture was seen as heavy, austere, and it lacked ornamentation. There was an imposing and almost a federal style of building to it. Like this imposing grandeur of the building that was solid and lacked gaiety. We don't have many examples on our landscape today, but a good example of it is the former Dixie Public School building. The Queen Anne style, it was a building style that was meant to impress. It was highly detailed, often whimsical, spoke of a life of leisure. Inspirations behind it came from a renewed interest in medieval and Elizabethan architecture. These buildings, which were often houses, quite often included tower elements with an emphasis on verandas, craftsmanship, often built of brick as well, giving a permanence to the landscape. And we have a couple of examples of Queen Anne architecture, and they're both former houses and both in the Port Credit area. And you can see those the tower style components of the houses. Queen Anne were often dressed up Edwardian structures. We'll talk about Edwardian in a moment, but they added a touch of whimsical, a touch of design and craftsmanship to otherwise austere facades. Neo-Gothic were often in grander buildings, church buildings, governmental buildings, schools and university principally. Something like University of Toronto, Mississauga, University of Toronto downtown is often, many of the buildings are in the Neo-Gothic tradition as well, emphasizing vaults, arches, exaggerated vertical lines, again, intended to point the viewer heavenward, if you will, to draw your eyes up. They're grander in scale than the previous Gothic Revival, tend to be monochromatic and often use stone, but again, for that idea of a permanent, solid base on the landscape. And one of our only examples of Neo-Gothic that survives in Mississauga is St. Andrew's Memorial Presbyterian Church in Port Credit. Renaissance Revival, taking its cues from the Renaissance movement and a reinterest in the Renaissance movement with a great deal of inspiration from Italian architecture. The Renaissance Revival movement saw the building of the Oddfellows Hall in Streetsville. And some of the things are vertical lines, decorative cornices, dentil corbels, Palladian windows, and the like. Very much a balanced facade, geometrically based designs meant to draw your eyes up to see the kind of this imposing edifice of the building. There's a sense of what was referred to as a calculated uniformity. They were meant to impress, these buildings. We do not have many examples in Mississauga. In fact, we only have the one, being the Oddfellows Hall, but a connection back to this Renaissance Revival movement that was once popular in public buildings in larger areas, and we had one built here in Streetsville in that era. Picturesque, or stick architecture as it's also known. The one example we have is the relocated former Credit Valley Railway Station, which was built in 1879 and relocated in 1914. They're seen as kind of this evolution of pictorial values of architecture on the landscape, of really connecting the place in which people live to the beauty of the landscape around them. And so you tended to have kind of this small movement of creating these whimsical style buildings. Quite often they were not used for houses necessarily, but were used in a little bit more public architecture, in this case a train station. Reference to it as marked by pleasing variety, irregularity, asymmetry, and interesting textures, meant to kind of create an undulating, non-uniform surface or fabric of the building. All the buildings were functional. They were also had a touch of the whimsical. They were seen as flamboyant and not valued on the landscape, or not of worth to continue. And they really, the picturesque stick architecture really dies out with the First World War and that return to austerity, given the crises that the world was facing at the time. And so this is a very short-lived movement, if you will, particularly locally, with only one surviving example that we document on our landscape. Second Empire, also known as Baroque Revival or Neo-Baroque. But the Second Empire, between 1870 and 1910, tended to be built typically of brick. They often incorporated mansard-style roof with rounder to gabled dormers, high windows, embellished moldings, steep roof lines. There's very seldom are there true examples of architectural styles of the Second Empire. They're quite often are blended with elements of other architectural styles. So for the former Streetsville Grammar School, now the Streetsville Kinsman Center, the Second Empire element is in the tower itself, which was added in 1877. You can see the mansard-style roof at the top. There's certainly some Italianate inspirations to this building as well. There's also a former the Taylor Froebel House in Arundel, which was built in the 1870s, that has that mansard-style roof and is an example of the Second Empire style in a residential structure. But again, these elements, these building styles, Second Empire and Baroque Revival, they're not common, and we do not have many examples on our landscape either. The Foursquare architecture, we come to a period of much more austere architectural styles. The Foursquare architecture, which came out of the United States, was seen as kind of an honest architectural style. It's a social response to the excesses and scene excesses of the Victorian architecture. You have square, boxy design, usually 2.5 stories high, 4 large square rooms per floor, center dormer, large porch, but austere, lacking ornamentation, lacking any gaiety. It's a solid, simple, austere building built in kind of the evolving response to the excesses of the Victorian age. And what you end up with is that these buildings that are heavy on the landscape, with a great deal of focus on craftsman style woodwork inside the building, but simple in form and ornamentation. Again, seen as honest style, a simple style of architecture. And there are some fine examples of Foursquare architecture in the city of Mississauga. The bungalow style of architecture, again, reflecting a little bit more of an affluence on the society. Large windows, usually a mix of rustic materials, whether it be stone, brick, stucco, some throwbacks to Tudor times. Large porches with enhanced overhangs, broad, low-pitched roof. Very popular. The style of architecture is very popular in magazines, and as people would explore the architectural concepts that were talked about in magazines, you tended to have people looking to replicate them on the landscape, and heavy influences from the arts and crafts movement at the time. But we have a couple of excellent examples of bungalow architecture here in the city of Mississauga, whether it be the Hamilton House or the Canavan House, both built around 1914, right on the early years of the First World War. I mentioned Edwardian architecture earlier. Edwardian was once quite common. There are a few examples of Edwardian architecture that survive today, but they're, again, a response to the Victorian era and the excesses and the increased ornamentation of the Victorian era. The Edwardian era, which comes to be under the reign of Queen Victoria's successor, King Edward. The buildings they're large in mass, but usually from a detailing are unassuming and humble compared to the Victorian era. There's a simplicity in function and form, with a movement towards kind of an emphasis on comfort rather than on the showing off of architecture. People have referred to our Edwardian architecture as having an understated elegance. And again, refined simplicity, lacking ornamentation, but solid, a solidity on the landscape as well, most often built of brick or stone. And a couple of examples that survive in Mississauga, fine examples of Edwardian architecture. But again, they are not common. This is something that we don't have a lot that survive in our city today. Colonial Revival was part of the Revival movements. A number of themes came out of the Revival movements, but the Revivals were born out of an attempt to recall kind of classical architectural styles, grander expressions with more ornate detailing. This is almost a throwback to the early settler time period, with a greater emphasis on detailing and solidity on the landscape. So it's kind of a blending of ideals, if you will. And the different classical styles led their way into the Colonial Revival period, whether it be through design and ornamentation, but you also had, Flemish or Dutch styles, Greek styles, Spanish styles finding their way in, but quite often expressed both in public buildings, such as the Arno Public School, or private family buildings, such as the Adamson Dairy House in Lakeview, built in 1932. But you had other colonial styles that came through in this time period. This idea of throwing back to to revive classical styles of architecture. You had something known as the Dutch Colonial Revival, which were characterized by gambrel roof, curved or flaring eaves. Can be asymmetrical at the time, but this throwback to this simpler, more romantic ideal of a time, and a couple of examples of Dutch Colonial Revival survive. You also had period revivals coming in, whether they take influences from Spanish architecture or Danish architecture on our landscape as well. They were often seen as graceful, elegant, departure from earlier styles that emphasize solidity and craftsmanship. And very seldom did they incorporate a single style, but they often blended multiple influences to create the edifice that we see today. Again, whether it be taking examples of Spanish architecture with a classical Greek flair, such as with A.R. Clark Memorial Hall in Port Credit, or whether you take a Danish or Belgian architecture for inspiration from Belgium, and creating something like the Grove Farm or the Adamson Estate down in Lakeview. But they're blending other colonial styles as well with this architectural style to create something that's quite unique and symbolized here on our landscape. You also had the Tudor Revival style, a couple of examples of Tudor Revival. It's often seen through alterations and added decorative design elements over time. Half timbering, often built of stone with brick accenting, arches, gables, multi-paneled windows. Kind of one referred to it as a mask of tradition. It wasn't really a traditional style of architecture, but the Tudor Revival used those elements to kind of create a sense of time on the landscape, or of occupation over a long period of time, when these are relatively new buildings, new styles being expressed in buildings on the landscape at the time that they were built. But they kind of wanted you to feel like that architecture would be around for generations. You also had something known as the Mission Revival. It took its influences from Spanish or Spanish Colonial Revival architecture, drawing its inspiration from 18th century Spanish missions in California and New Mexico. And again, a blend of architectural styles, including Renaissance and Baroque detailing, long arcades, tiled roofs, unadorned stucco finishes, porticos, and the like. We have one fine example of that on Mississauga Road in a private family home that was once known as Arcadia, the home of John Paris Bickle, built in 1929. The eclectic style of architecture, we see it in often associated with the arts and craft movement through its inspirations, but we can see the eclectic architecture both in something like Glen Erin Hall, built in 1928, or Riverwood, also known as the Parker Chapel Estate, built in 1919. And the eclectic architecture really refers to any design that incorporates elements of traditional motifs and styles, ornaments, structural features that came from other architectural periods. So really a blending of styles, and taking their inspiration and their influences from the arts and craft movement of, fine woodworking detailing, emphasis on craftsmanship, permanence on the landscape building out of stone. But the unbalanced facade is also part of that. There's an expression that's being made through this landscape for kind of a wealthy time period of landed property owners who could afford to build these grand rambling structures, if you will. And again, a couple of examples that survive on our landscape today. Prairie architecture, it's a fascinating style, but we do not have historic examples of prairie architecture that survive. The one example that we have, which is a fine example of prairie architecture, was a remodeled house that was only completed in 2008. The prairie style of architecture was connected with the famed designs of Frank Lloyd Wright and the arts and craft movements. Wide horizontal lines, unobstructed views, kind of no very simple ornamentation, without the kind of the touch of the exotic or historical associations with other architecture. Low horizontal proportions to the roof, gently pitched roofs with projecting eaves. And so these are really kind of expressions on the landscape and meant to not only blend in, but be in harmony with the landscape around them, not overpowering architecture, generally speaking. But we do not have, again, historic architecture styles of that ilk. There are some in the province today. They weren't that common, but we do have a more modern example built as kind of a tribute to the ideas of the famed Frank Lloyd Wright and the prairie style of architecture. Modern classical architecture, modern classicism, we see an example of that down at Gairloch, also known as the Bell Harding House, built in 1938. Kind of a connection to this evolving machine age of the kind of the wealthy 1920s into the 1930s, particularly with the more affluent families of the time that have resisted the in some ways, the down times of the Great Depression. Although there's an absence of ornamentation and kind of an emphasis on steel and glass and concrete, the buildings themselves were quite grand in their aspirations and their design. And part of the building itself was really embracing the landscape in which it sit, and the landscaping, the design of the property itself around the building are meant to complement and work in synergy with the building style itself. Georgian Revival, and a fine example of that is Lawton, the Cawthra estate down in Lakeview, built in 1926. It shared many of the earlier traits of the Georgian style of architecture the Georgian Revival did. Houses were generally two-storied, rectangular with heavy trim, emphasized symmetry and order. Chimneys and entrances became more prominent and were meant to, in a way, demonstrate a connection to the national past, this ideal of the settler identity that was Canada and the Canadian mentality. This was designed as a connection to that fabled past, if you will, the grandeur of the history of the formation of the country. And that's worth a greater discussion at some point, as well as this identity of what is Canadian. But this became an architectural style that was meant to connect to, reflect, and pay honor to, or pay homage to, that Canadian identity in the building of the nation through this solid expression on the landscape. You also had something, or the Art Deco movement that's evolving. This is the former Vogue Theatre in Port Credit. Art Deco came after the First World War. It was a split from past architectural traditions designed to celebrate new technologies, particularly electricity. It drew its inspirations from Africa, Egypt, Turkey, and even Japan. The architectural expression was seen as lavish and exotic. And we have a few examples of it, but one of the ones that does survive is the former Vogue Theatre. Although it has undergone a little bit of a facelift over time, you can still see the vertical lines of the original architectural style that came about as a result of the Art Deco movement. The international style, we have a fine example here in Mississauga of the international style private family home down in Port Credit, which was built in 1939. This is a building where form follows function. It's built from the interior uses of the space, a resetting of values of what is important in architecture on the family. The focus was on volume and not the space itself. Unadorned, balanced, no cornices or lintels. Some people see it as an unfinished style of architecture, but nonetheless, the international style was quite widespread and quite celebrated at the time. And we have, again, a fine example of international architecture here in the city of Mississauga. The Art Moderne movement closely followed on the Art Deco movement, looking to the future, crafted elements, emphasis on machinery and mass production, streamlined hard edges, glass blocks. Most often used in public buildings, restaurants, banks, theaters, and the like at the time. We do not have many examples on our landscape of Art Moderne, but certainly we do have some that survive in one a public garage, one a former bank, now a drugstore in the Port Credit area. Cottage or storybook architecture of smaller footprint designed to recall kind of storybook charm. They were often built kind of in and around the Second World War, either just before or just after. Often residential structures, steeply sloped, uneven roof lines, often referred to also as cat slide, and hip roofs, unadorned entrances, heavy prominent chimneys, low slung entranceways. Often meant to be unobtrusive on the landscape and to recall that kind of idealism of kind of the English garden, if you will, of a storybook setting, of romantic ideals of kind of a simple and quiet life in the country, if you will. Victory housing, something that we still see a great deal bit on our landscape. Were built as a government effort to supply housing post-Second World War. Buildings were prefabricated, uniform, tidy, orderly, houses designed to be comfortable, room for a single family, and many Canadian cities have sections within the city that are referred to as victory villages or victory housing. And this reflected, again, that ideal of the Second World War of building affordable housing options, not only for families who are supporting the war effort, but also for returning soldiers. And you have the victory elements, and we have a couple of victory subdivisions in Mississauga, one north of Streetsville and the other one in the Malton area, that reflect this ideal of housing post Second World War. Mid-century modern, you see kind of an attempt to put to the hardships of the Great Depression and the Second World War behind people, to move on with completely new ideas of living arrangements. You see some early subdivisions, particularly in the Park Royal area of Mississauga, that are built in the late 50s and early 1960s. This idea of modern conveniences with carports and garages, emphasizing a horizontal living space, not a vertical space, to emphasize the ability to have space around you. Sleek, long, low silhouette, minimal ornamentation, and a horizontal footprint on the landscape. But you have this very different perspective on this evolving architectural style of the mid-century modern, in and around the end of the Second World War, petering out in the late 1960s. Googie or Contempo architecture of the 1950s and 1970 to the 1970s. Minimalist architecture, often built in concrete, and kind of a Contempo is a lighthearted version of minimalism, and comes in just before the oppressive times of the Brutalist movement, and we'll look at that in a moment. Googie or Contempo architecture was seen as light and cheerful, emanating from a period of relative optimism. And we have one documented example of Contempo architecture, and it is a fine example, a celebrated one, and that is the Canadian Tire gas bar, the canopy in Clarkson, which was built around 1960, emphasizing this optimism, this lighthearted movement in time, this emphasis on concrete styles, quite prevalent in that architectural movement at the time. Postmodern architecture, our City Hall and the Xerox office building on Winston Churchill are examples of postmodern architecture. Geometric structures superimposed with other structures meant to contrast visually, differing forms that are overlaid, interconnected, interlaced, sought to achieve stunning or unusual visual effects, and seen by many to kind of be a chaotic blend of different architectural influences at the time. But postmodern, again, is a very forward-looking style of architecture, to look to the future with optimism, and express that optimism on the built form on the landscape today. And so, again, examples: the Mississauga Civic Center and the Xerox office building of postmodern architecture in the city of Mississauga. You also had the Brutalist movement. Brutalism was seen at a time where, if concrete was good, more concrete was better. Practical, inexpensive solution for monumental buildings in adverse climates, quite prevalent in universities and other public buildings at the time. It was not a long-lived architectural style, but often met with derision or opposition to the ideals that it was expressing. But buildings allowed for mass monumental buildings with a large floor print that required minimal upkeep, and again, the idea that form follows function. So this is built for what it did rather than what it would look like. And so you have a fine example of the Brutalist style of architecture is the Davis building at the University of Toronto Mississauga campus here in Mississauga. Architecture really is expressions over time. The city of Mississauga, as we know it today, largely developed in the late 1960s into the 1980s, right up to the present day, which brought its own architectural stylings at the time. But within the city itself are many, many different architectural styles that long predate the formation of the city of Mississauga. And they speak to those formative years of the city, the people who once lived here, the decisions that were being made of how people viewed the landscape, viewed the materials in which they built, viewed the expressions of the buildings that they were building on the landscape, and how they fit within that landscape, how they fit with the evolving social structure of the time, what it is that the builders of buildings were trying to express in terms of their views on where they stood in society and where society itself stood at the time in which they were building. Architecture of all time periods reflect the social ideals of that time period, and those ideals would be one of the foundation stones for what would build the city of Mississauga. So, in a way, the historic buildings on our landscape are very much a time capsule that help tell the evolution story of the city of Mississauga. But very seldom is there a true example of one particular style. Most often, what we see in any historic building is a blend of styles and inspirations. And they were built as vernacular, everyday adaptations to more popular, grander styles that would be used in public buildings or houses of wealthy individuals, that would be highlighted in magazines and the like. But we have all kinds of different architectural styles within the city of Mississauga that really help to highlight and shape our understanding of our past and the eras over which people have lived in this community and interacted with this landscape and left their imprint on this landscape. People don't build things, take pictures of things that they want to forget. People want to remember the time, even if it's a reflection back on an earlier architectural time period. Decisions are made to create, to preserve, to alter, perhaps even in more fashionable perspectives of what architecture could be on the landscape. Again, we're not meant to see kind of the original form necessarily of the building. We're always meant to see what the latest addition, alteration, facade was for a building. Buildings were always attempted to be fashionable and to connect to an actual practical purpose on the landscape. So vernacular adaptations to grander ideas is an excellent way of looking at historic Mississauga's architecture at that over time. So with that, thank you very much for joining us on this Saturday matinee to explore architectural traditions and styles within the city of Mississauga. And the next time you go for a walk or go for a drive around the city, you might look at it with slightly different eyes as you explore and wonder about how old is that house and who built it, and perhaps the question we should be asking is why? What does it express? What story could the house tell if it could talk to us? And they can talk to us. We just have to know how to listen to them. And I do draw you again back to the book by Professor Thomas McElbraith, Looking for Old Ontario, an excellent guide to exploring the built and natural landscape of Ontario, with some excellent interplays to review and analyze the historic landscape of Mississauga as it peeks through in its historic buildings. So thank you so much for exploring some historic architectural styles with us and spending some time with us here on our Saturday matinee.